All right. For this week, our first reading is going to be Jeffrey Jerome Cohen on the necessity of ignoring those who offer themselves as examples. It's a really interesting chapter in comparison to the others. The last few that we've read have really set themselves apart in different ways, especially last week we read Asa Mittman's chapter. This would be better if I had a co author, and that sets itself apart differently in a few ways. Number one, the tone and the content are radically different. Mittman's use of humor is a bit more on point than someone like Gillespie, where when we were in class together still, we talked about the ways in which her jokes didn't really resonate with the audience. That when we were reading it, there was no one in the classroom that felt like her attempts at humor were landing anywhere, that they were hitting the mark. And based on the discussion forums, Mittman's use of humor seemed a little bit more conversational and a little bit more relatable. Mittman was also talking about co authorship, which is something that no one else has even touched in any way, not even in the most kind of indirect sense of peer review, which we've discussed as a form of co authorship in the sense of more hands getting on the page and then more brains putting ideas into the paper, which, whether or not that's co authorship, is debatable, but this kind of collective effort to make a given piece of writing even better. What we have with Cohen is different. In terms of the content, he is much more in line with all of the other authors, where he's saying, in the past, I've written like this. These past actions have in some way created these behaviors of today. What Cohen does very differently than everyone else is he doesn't write anything really new for this chapter. We open up on page 45, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen. We get our author on the necessity of ignoring those who offer themselves as examples. We get this kind of provocative title, low stakes provocative. Then we get a subheading, habit and routine. We get a parenthetical, a blog post, 2011, which tells us that what follows isn't something that he wrote for this book. It's something that he wrote for his blog. At this point, almost a decade ago. Um, at the point that this book was published, I want to say it's 2016, 2015. So at the point that the book was published, it was only a couple of years old. Um, but even then, being just a few years old, it aged very quickly. That section goes from page 45 through 48, where we get the end of his first blog post, and then we get a second section accompanied by a second image. Of course, that we're completely starting over again. The second one is called Writing Lockdown, and then our parenthetical reads, some Facebook status updates 2013. And then we go from page 49 through 54 that gives us these kind of periodic status updates from his Facebook account before we get backwards glance and then a parenthetical. Written on a holiday when I got up early due to stress over having too much writing to do, 2015. So this last section is more contemporaneous with the writing for the rest of the book. And in that sense, he's giving us something a little bit more recent. But the first more than 2/3 of this chapter are recycled. That these are blog posts and Facebook status updates. And one of the questions that I have for you is, in terms of this chapter, are you getting your money's worth? All of the other authors wrote something new for use here. Cohen took something that he'd already written in a very informal setting. So we've got a blog post, and then we've got Facebook status updates, which are even more informal and even more dated, right? Like, um, do we feel like Cohen cut some inappropriate corners in using his blog post? Should he have written something new? Should he have written something new even that summarizes his blog post there, or where he says, "I've written about this in a blog post. See the link here." Now, now I'm going to reflect on what I've written before, because the way we think about writing today is not the same as we're going to think about writing 3 4 years from now, or 3 or 4 years ago. Think of your approaches to writing compared to now. And there's that's not a perfect parallel, especially since Cohen's quite a bit older. He's got quite a few books. He's got quite a few articles. He's edited quite a few collections. So he does a lot of writing, but that just gives him even more room to redefine his relationships with writing over time. So, first question for you is a question of ethics. Is it a breach to take these things? The second question is, what does it do to our conception of him? So, not just ethics, but ethos. When we talked about Gillespie, we talked about how out of touch she is. Um, One kind of fascinating thing about this book is all of the older scholars. We start with Akbari, Gillespie. Mittman doesn't do it so much. He ages himself in a different way. But then we get Cohen, where they all reference Facebook. And one of my questions is, what's going on with this kind of repetition of scholars saying, like, "Hey, I use Facebook. I do academic things on Facebook." Is that does that change our opinion of them, to know that they're on Facebook and that they're actively using Facebook, especially now, quite a few years after this book was published, even further since some of these people were writing about it, where Facebook is really kind of relegated. I don't know. It's not the popular social media anymore. I think it's really more for the kind of older millennial crowd, is the group that's still kind of on Facebook and using it. So, number one, should he have written something new? And number two, what is going on with this emphasis on this kind of outdated social media that even in 2015, Facebook was starting to get replaced?